In the dim light of a medieval cathedral, the air thick with the scent of incense, a priest raises the consecrated host. The moment is charged with mystery. The bread and wine, through the power of God, are transformed into the body and blood of Christ. But what exactly does this mean? Can the body of Christ, in all its physical reality, be present on the altar without the bread and wine being physically there? This is the question that has puzzled some of the greatest minds of the Middle Ages, and it leads us into a labyrinth of philosophical and theological debate. The central figure in this debate is Thomas Aquinas, a Dominican friar whose works have shaped Christian thought for centuries. Aquinas argues that the transformation, known as transubstantiation, is a complete conversion of the substance of the bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ. After the consecration, the substance of the bread and wine is no longer present, but the accident's sensory qualities like taste, color, and texture remain. This raises a profound question. How can accidents exist without their substance? For Aquinas, the answer lies in the power of God. He maintains that God can indeed preserve the accidents of the bread and wine without their substance, but he also recognizes that this is not a simple matter. Four principal arguments challenge the possibility of accidents existing without their subject. First, Aquinas points out that accidents are inherently dependent on their substance. They are like the properties of a thing, like the color of a shirt, or the length of a table, that cannot exist on their own. Without the shirt, the color has nothing to be the color of. Without the table, the length has nothing to measure. This dependency is a fundamental principle of Aristotelian philosophy, which Aquinas follows closely. Second, Aquinas argues that the very nature of accidents is to inhere in a substance. They are not self-sufficient entities, but rather modifications of a substance. For example, the whiteness of a piece of paper is a property of the paper, not something that can exist independently. To say that an accident can exist without its substance is like saying that the whiteness can float in the air without the paper. Third, Aquinas contends that the existence of accidents without a substance would lead to a logical contradiction. If an accident could exist without its substance, it would be both an accident and a substance, which is a contradiction in terms. Accidents are defined by their dependence on a substance, and if they could exist independently, they would no longer be accidents. Fourth, Aquinas notes that the concept of an accident without a substance is foreign to the created order. In the natural world, we never see accidents existing independently. The color of a flower, the shape of a tree, the sound of a bell, all these are inseparable from the things they describe. To posit the existence of accidents without a substance is to imagine a world that is fundamentally different from the one we know. Despite these arguments, Aquinas believes that God's power is not limited by the natural order. God can do what is metaphysically possible, and the preservation of accidents without their substance is within God's power. However, this power must be exercised in a way that is consistent with the nature of things. God can preserve the accidents of the bread and wine without their substance, but only because he is the ultimate source of all being. This debate is not just a matter of abstract philosophy. It touches on the very heart of Christian belief in the Eucharist. If the body of Christ can be present on the altar without the bread and wine being physically there, it means that the Eucharist is a profound mystery of faith, where the ordinary elements of bread and wine are transformed into the most sacred reality. As we delve deeper into this debate, we will explore the arguments of Aquinas and his contemporaries, and we will see how their ideas have shaped the understanding of the Eucharist in the Christian tradition. The journey will take us through the intricate world of medieval philosophy and theology, where the most fundamental questions of existence and reality are explored with a depth and rigor that still resonate today. In the complex world of philosophical and theological debates, Thomas Aquinas tackled several key issues surrounding the nature of accidents and substance, particularly in the context of the Eucharist. The Eucharist, a central sacrament in Christian tradition, involves the transformation of bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ. This transformation raises several metaphysical and semantic questions that Aquinas addresses with great detail and nuance. One of the primary issues is the definition problem. It seems contradictory to separate a definition from what it defines. For instance, a substance is defined as something that exists by itself, and an accident is defined as something that exists in a substance. Aquinas argues that this problem arises from a misunderstanding of the nature of being. Being is not a genus, a broad category, from which different species, more specific categories, can be derived. Instead, being is the fundamental reality that all things participate in. Substance and accident are not species of being, but distinct modes of being. A substance exists by itself, and an accident exists in a substance. These modes are naturally appropriate to their respective categories, and can be altered by divine intervention. The S-problem, or the problem of existence, posits that a thing cannot exist without its act of existing S. For an accident, this act of existing is its inherence in a substance. Aquinas clarifies that while it is true that an accident's existence is tied to its subject, this does not mean that the accident's existence is impossible without a substance. Divine power can miraculously sustain an accident's existence, even when the substance is removed. For example, the accidents of bread and wine can continue to exist after the substance of bread and wine is transformed into the body and blood of Christ. The individuation problem concerns how accidents can be individualized. Individuation typically involves matter and quantitative dimensions. In normal circumstances, accidents are individuated by the substance they inhere in. However, in the Eucharist, the substance is removed, yet the accidents remain. Aquinas explains that divine power can make the quantitative dimensions of the accidents exist per se, thus individuating them. This means that the accidents can still be perceived as individual entities, even without the substance. The natural signification problem arises because the accidents of bread and wine naturally signify the presence of their substance. If the substance is no longer there, the accidents would seem to signify a falsehood. Aquinas resolves this by noting that the senses perceive the accidents veridically, but it is the intellect, informed by faith, that understands the absence of the substance. Therefore, there is no deception involved, as the faithful are aware of the transformation. Aquinas also addresses the issue of how the accidents can remain causally interactive after the substance is removed. Normally, it is the whole substance that acts, not its parts. However, in the Eucharist, the accidents, particularly the quantity, can act because they exist per se. The qualities that inhere in the quantity retain their causal powers and can act in the same ways they did when the substance was present. Another issue is the no substantial form problem. In normal circumstances, the substantial form is the remote cause of action, acting through active and passive qualities. When the substantial form is removed, it seems that the qualities should lose their causal powers. Aquinas argues that divine power preserves the instrumental powers of the qualities, allowing them to continue acting as they did before. The no prime matter problem concerns the material cause in changes. In Aristotelian philosophy, prime matter persists through changes, but if the prime matter of bread and wine is removed, it is unclear where the matter for new substances like worms or ashes comes from. Aquinas suggests that the indeterminate dimensions which make matter divisible can persist and become the indeterminate dimensions of new substances. Divine power can either bring back prime matter or supply it, ensuring that the new substances can form without increasing the total amount of matter in the universe. Aquinas applies these principles to specific cases. For example, he argues that the sacramental species can nourish those who consume them, as they can be converted into new parts of a human body. He also discusses what happens when non-wine liquids are added to a consecrated chalice. The mixture can result in a combination of sacramental species and the new liquid, with the blood of Christ remaining in the parts that have not been changed. Through these detailed explanations, Aquinas provides a comprehensive framework for understanding the metaphysical and causal aspects of the Eucharist, ensuring that the sacrament remains both philosophically coherent and theologically sound. In the 11th century, a debate arose about the nature of the Eucharist, the bread and wine that are believed to become the body and blood of Christ during the Mass. Berengar of Tours was forced to swear that the real body of Christ, the one born of Mary and crucified under Pontius Pilate, is broken by the hands of priests and consumed by the faithful. However, Thomas Aquinas disagreed, arguing that this statement should not be taken literally. According to Aquinas, the body of Christ is not physically present in the bread and wine in a way that it can be touched, broken, or chewed. Instead, the bread and wine, known as the sacramental species, are what are actually broken and consumed. The body of Christ, though truly present, remains with the sacramental species in a spiritual way, providing spiritual nourishment, while the bread and wine provide physical nourishment. Giles of Rome, another influential thinker, further explored the philosophical implications of this belief. He and Aquinas agreed that the body of Christ is brought to the altar through a process called transubstantiation, where the bread and wine are transformed into the body and blood of Christ. However, this transformation leaves behind the accidents of the bread and wine its visible and tangible properties without their substance. This raised a significant philosophical question: how can accidents exist without a substance? Giles acknowledged that, in normal circumstances, accidents are always found in a substance. For example, the color of an apple is an accident that exists in the apple, the substance. However, he argued that not all accidents are the same. Some accidents, like the color of an apple, depend on the substance for their existence. Others, like the size of an apple, can exist independently of a substance. In the case of the Eucharist, Giles proposed that the accidents of the bread and wine, such as their size and shape, can continue to exist even after the substance of the bread and wine is no longer there. Giles also considered the role of God in this process. He argued that God, as the supreme cause, can act alone to produce and maintain the existence of these accidents without needing a substance. For example, God can make the size and shape of the bread exist independently, without the bread itself. This is possible because these accidents, like size, do not need a substance to exist in the same way that color does. Giles further explained that among the accidents, some, like color, are closely tied to the substance and cannot exist without it. These accidents are individuated by the substance, meaning they are specific to that particular substance. For example, the color of one apple is different from the color of another apple. However, other accidents, like size, can exist independently. God can make the size of the bread exist without the bread itself, because size does not need the bread to be a specific size. Giles also discussed the role of quantity in the Eucharist. Quantity, or the size and shape of something, is a fundamental property that is closely related to matter. He argued that quantity is more like matter than other accidents because it is necessary for matter to exist. For example, matter cannot exist without having some size or shape. In the Eucharist, Giles believed that the quantity of the bread and wine can persist and serve as the basis for other accidents, like color and taste, even after the substance of the bread and wine is no longer there. This leads to the question of how the accidents of the bread and wine can change, even though the substance is gone. Giles explained that the accidents can still change in the same way they do in normal situations. For example, the bread can still be broken, and the wine can still be poured, even though the substance of the bread and wine is no longer present. He argued that the quantity of the bread and wine, which persists, can serve as the basis for these changes. For instance, the shape of the bread can change when it is broken, even though the bread itself is no longer there. Giles also addressed the issue of how the accidents of the bread and wine can be the cause of other changes, like the bread becoming putrefied or the wine turning into vinegar. He argued that the accidents, particularly the quantity, can act as the material cause of these changes. For example, the quantity of the bread can serve as the basis for the bread to become putrefied, even though the bread itself is no longer present. Finally, Giles considered the broader implications of these ideas. He argued that the accidents of the bread and wine can still act in the world, even though the substance of the bread and wine is no longer there. This means that the bread can still be broken, the wine can still be poured, and the accidents can still cause other changes, like the bread becoming putrefied or the wine turning into vinegar. This is possible because God can maintain the existence of these accidents without the substance, and the accidents can still serve as the basis for these changes. In this way, Giles provided a detailed philosophical framework for understanding how the Eucharist can maintain its physical properties and still be the body and blood of Christ, even though the substance of the bread and wine is no longer present. Giles of Rome, a medieval philosopher, grappled with the mystery of how worms and ashes could form from bread that had been transformed into the body of Christ during the Eucharist. This transformation, known as transubstantiation, posed a significant challenge because the bread, once transformed, no longer existed in its original form. Giles followed the ideas of Aquinas, another prominent medieval philosopher, in exploring this issue. Giles rejected the idea that the matter of the bread could return to its original state to form the worms and ashes. He argued that, given the nature of the Eucharist, the bread and its prime matter could not return once they had been transubstantiated into the body of Christ. The body of Christ remains present as long as the bread's accidents, its qualities and attributes are present. When these accidents change, the body of Christ departs, and new substances, like worms and ashes, appear. Giles also dismissed the idea that the surrounding air could provide the matter for the new substances. He pointed out that the air would need to move into the space where the bread once was, but this movement would take time. Since the new substances appear instantly, the air could not arrive in time to provide the necessary matter. Additionally, medieval science held that complex substances like worms could not be generated from a single element like air. To address these issues, Giles proposed a solution that minimized the need for miracles. He suggested that, at the moment the worms or ashes are generated, several things happen simultaneously. The bread's accidents disappear, new accidents appear, the body of Christ departs, matter appears, and the substantial form of the worms or ashes is introduced. The new accidents that appear first dispose the matter to receive the substantial form of the new substance. This process, Giles argued, is not more miraculous than the natural process of human conception, where God creates the soul to join with the matter of the fetus. Giles further explained that when something has a natural order to another, it is not miraculous for them to be conjoined, even if God's intervention is required. For example, it is not a miracle when a human being begets another human, even though the intellectual soul must be created by God. The process remains natural, because the matter is naturally disposed to receive the soul. In the context of the Eucharist, the initial miracle is the transformation of the bread into the body of Christ. After this, the continued existence of the bread's accidents is not miraculous. When these accidents change, the new accidents naturally dispose the matter to receive the substantial form of worms or ashes, and God's concurrence ensures that the matter appears at the right moment. Giles also addressed the problem of how accidents, qualities, could generate new substantial forms. He noted that accidents, which are lower on the scale of being, cannot produce something higher without the power of their substantial form. For example, wine accidents can change water into wine because they act in the power of the wine's substantial form, even though the form is no longer present. This is similar to how lion semen can dispose matter to receive a lion's soul, even though the lion's soul is not present. By these arguments, Giles attempted to explain the natural processes involved in the transformation of the Eucharist, while still acknowledging the necessary role of God's intervention. His approach aimed to reconcile the supernatural aspects of the Eucharist with the natural laws of the universe as understood in his time. Scotus takes on the traditional arguments that try to show the essential dependence of accidents on substances by making a crucial distinction between what a thing is naturally capable of and what it actually does. He argues that a thing's natural aptitude to exist in a certain way is part of its essence. For example, it is essential for a substance to be naturally capable of existing on its own, while it is essential for an accident to be naturally capable of existing in another thing. This distinction is important because it means that the natural capacity to exist in a certain way divides being, but the actual way it exists does not. Scotus then points out that many natural capacities can be blocked. For instance, an earthen object's natural tendency to move towards the center of the earth can be stopped by a floor or a bat. Similarly, divine power can block natural capacities, such as when the human nature of Christ, which is naturally capable of existing on its own, is united with the divine nature in the Incarnation. This means that the actual existence of a substance on its own or an accident in another is not essential, but rather contingent. Scotus also challenges the idea that the natural order of things makes accidents dependent on substances in an essential way. He argues that while it is true that accidents naturally depend on substances, this dependence is not absolute. God's power can supply the role of the substance, meaning that an accident can exist without its usual subject. This further undermines the idea that actual existence in a subject is essential to accidents. Scotus then proposes a new way to divide being into absolute and relative. Absolute beings, like substances and qualities, do not essentially include relations. Relative beings, on the other hand, must have a foundation and a term to exist. This means that while some accidents like relations must exist in a subject, other accidents like qualities can exist independently. To address the objection that this leads to an infinite regress of relations, Scotus explains that a relation is really distinct from its foundation, if the foundation can exist without the relation. For example, whiteness can exist without being in Socrates, but the relation of whiteness to Socrates is distinct from the whiteness itself. This avoids the infinite regress because the relation of whiteness to Socrates is not a new, distinct entity, but is instead a formal distinction within the whiteness. Scotus also addresses the argument that accidents are essentially dependent on their subjects, because the subject is a material cause. He counters that the union of a subject and an accident is accidental, not essential. For example, white Socrates is an accidental union, not a new essential being. This means that the dependence of accidents on their subjects is not absolute, and can be altered by divine power. Finally, Scotus discusses the nature of sensible qualities, and their relationship to quantity. He rejects the idea that sensible qualities are individuated by quantity, arguing that quantity and quality are distinct categories. He also distinguishes between the proximate and remote potential for being sensed. A quality like whiteness is naturally capable of being sensed, but it only actually does so when it exists in a quantitative form. This means that whiteness can exist without being in a quantitative form. Thus, it is metaphysically possible for sensible qualities to exist independently of quantity. In summary, Scotus's arguments challenge the traditional views on the essential dependence of accidents on substances and the nature of sensible qualities. He proposes a new way of understanding being, where absolute beings can exist independently, and the relationship between accidents and their subjects is more flexible and contingent, ultimately influenced by divine power.